ready to do my, go back here. Now my screen share. Here we go. So we're following up, having a series about Jews in America. Coming to America, a handful of refugees from South America in 1654, and going through the early wave, the Sephardic wave, then the early Jewish wave, and then we have, I call this the Russians are coming, and then Alan Arkin passed away, and he was a very important figure in that movie, if you remember it, and then Theodor Bickel was the submarine commander from the Russian side. So when I say Russians, I mean this wave of Eastern Europe, because Russia basically controlled much of what was Eastern Europe at that time. So from the 1880s to the 1920s, we had this massive wave of migration from Eastern Europe, but also from other parts of the Jewish world to America. But the biggest concentration settling in New York, but a large number going, for example, to Chicago, or there was a group that were going to be sent to Galveston, Texas, because we're getting too many in New York, and they didn't want the anti-Semites to get at us for flooding the country. So they thought if we snuck them into Galveston, they wouldn't notice. But there was a big hurricane that wiped out Galveston just before they were followed through, so they never got in big quantities to Galveston. Stuck in Manhattan Island and the other boroughs. Well, this group would begin literally at the bottom of the barrel, because they came to a great extent from the bottom of the barrel in Eastern Europe. And they would shape America into the American century. The 20th century was called the American century. When Trump says, make America great again, it's because Americans feel that we used to be great. 20th century was the great American. It happens, then I said, still the dominant power of the world. Russia's sort of fizzling. Chinese can't get their economy back up like it should. But we don't feel it, right? Then we felt it. So we created new categories of industry, film, media, new categories of culture, Tin Pan Alley, Vaudeville Broadway, Berlin, music, Gershwin, Bernstein, leaders in American finance, advisors to government, justices, senators, shaping literary and academic world. Now, we had, when America started out, 3,000 Jews with the founding of America, the United States. The German wave grew to 150,000 Jews, and they took their part very comfortably. All of a sudden, in a few decades, there were 2,400,000 new Jews on top of this in such a short time. How did they get there? Such a huge quantity. What spread it on? Well, the end of the 18th century, there were three major European powers that carved up the Kingdom of Poland. The Kingdom of Poland was once the great power of Europe, stretched over Lithuania, Ukraine, right? And was undoubtedly Prussia. Right, yeah, Prussia itself was swallowed up by Poland. You'll see the map, yes. And so also culturally, Copernicus in Poland, and a democratic regime. The Jews did very well in the early Poland. It was a liberal country in many ways. Well, unfortunately, the liberalism made it a weak country eventually. And so these three major powers decided to chop it up. The luckiest ones were the ones in Silesia, in the western part of Poland. They came under the Prussians, what would become the German Empire. Most advanced country now at that time, and for Jews, much better situation. Then the next in line of luck were those in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which took over southeastern Poland, Galicia. They'd also taken over Czechoslovakia, Czech, Slovaks, Hungary, part of the dual monarchy, the Balkans, right? And that empire as well extended civil rights to Jews. Took time, but condition for Jews was relatively okay. The least fortunate would be the ones in Poland proper, and the Ukrainian parts of Russia, of Poland, and the Baltic states. They would come under the control of Tsarist Russia. Now, so here's the map, just so you can see how it's chopped up. Nice big country, and it's a meat slicer in different stages. You can see 2 to 3 stages. The Russian chopping is on the, I don't know what we call this, taupe color on the map. You can see the first chop is places like Polotsk and Myczysław. And then you go into the next slice, which is Belarus, Minsk, and Zhytomyr. Is that Zhytomyr? Yeah, and Wrocław. Yeah, brought the Jews in. Yes, right. And the Poles were very, right? Poland was a very successful country till it became unsuccessful. And then the last was like Lithuania, Vilna, and Lutsk, those areas. Then the other side, the Prussian side, yeah, if you notice, the white is Prussia proper, where it's isolated by Poland on all sides. Well, at this point, they had already taken over control of more central parts of Germany, the Hohenzollern, and then took back what they thought was theirs. So Poznan and Gdansk, Danzig, right, now became, and all became part of the German realms. Right. And then the Austrians, I forgot to say, the Russians took the best part. They took Warsaw, right? The heart of Poland. Russians took that. That's the blue. Huh? Central Poland. Yeah, on the map, it looks like it's under the Prussians, but it's really under the Russians, right? So the map may not be correct. So, and then, right, the Duchy, yeah, they went back and forth. That's true. The Duchy of Warsaw was the, oh, I get it. Okay. And then the Hungarian side, the Austrians, Krakow, Lublin, Lvov, right? Those areas, right? Lvov. What? Later. Okay. Yeah, so it's in pieces. It's in bits and pieces. There were some other things I think that they added here and there. Well, why was it so difficult for the Russians to absorb the Jews when the Austrians and the Germans could? Because Kievan Rus and then later Muscovite Rus had relatively few Jews for centuries. There was a case of a Russian prince who adopted Judaism and he was killed for it. And so they were afraid of Jewish influence, Judaizing heresy, and they kept Jews out. And all of a sudden they found themselves the core of Jews of world Jewry, the largest single population of world Jewry, and they had it in their borders. So they didn't know what to do. What do you do with Jews? They're Christ killers. What do you do with them? They killed our Lord. So the policies would go back and forth from grudging tolerance, okay, to eradicating them, active eradication, or sometimes then giving them rights, taking them away. And so, for example, they instituted the draft system. Now, the Russians had draft system for everybody, but they figured that this draft system would be very good for controlling Jews. You get Jewish youth younger than you do with the other Russians, Cantonists, right? As young as 7 or 8, even though the law was 12 to 18 for Jews, but it was older for non-Jews. Why? Because you would put them in the army for 25-year service, hoping they would die off. You solve that problem, or that they would be like their comrades in arms and become Russian Orthodox and abandon this whole Jewish mess. The numbers go from 25,000 to 70,000 draftees. It's not such a huge number. What happened, though, was it turned Jews against Jews, because they were all subject to this draft, and each one would hide his youngster, so go to the other one. So it made Jews betray each other to make the quota. Also, to restrict the poisoning of Jews on the great pure Russian soul, they restricted the right of Jews to settle only in what they called the Pale of Settlement, the limits of settlement, which would basically be those territories that they had just swallowed up, and some other regions to the east that they would allow Jews to settle, because they would say, okay, we need to settle these newly conquered territories. We'll let Jews in there. They won't ruin the rest of us Russians, but they'll develop it for us. So this became what's called the Pale of Settlement. Those who are Russian readers can see the bright green is pure Russia, Riga, Petersburg, Moskva, Kharkiv. That's Russia proper. No Jews officially allowed. The Jews snuck in, but if they're caught, they're kicked out. And then proper, you have Vilna, Warsaw, Minsk, Kiev, Odessa, Katerinoslav, right? That's the Jewish area. Okay, so 2.5 million people. No, it's I don't remember what the number is, but several million, and they're there. So there was some liberalization for Russia in general. They were influenced by what was going on in the West. So Tsar Alexander II was a liberalizing Tsar. For example, they extended liberalism to their own peoples, right? Russia was serf. 1/3 of all Russians were serfs. And the serf system in Russia was far more restrictive than the old feudal systems of Europe. The serf was sold back and forth. In the feudal system, the serf stayed with the land. You could sell the land, the serf with it, but not the serf separately. In the Russian system, you could sell the serf back and forth like any slave. And they got their emancipation. That's the same word we use in the United States. The Edict of Emancipation, freedom, about the same time that slaves in the United States were emancipated. It was 1861, not far off. But what happened? 1881, Tsar Alexander was assassinated by revolutionaries. The advances were not enough. Right? This is what we call revolution of rising expectation. As you begin to move up, you expect more. Wasn't enough. So it led to, as we would guess, the need to find scapegoats, increased wave of repression, save Mother Russia. What did you say? Save Mother Russia? And save Mother Russia. All right. So Jews were perfect scapegoats because they weren't Russians, they weren't Ukrainians, right? So everybody could dump on the Jews. And so there actually was a very noted figure, Nicholas Pobedonostev, who actually was considered a great theoretician of government management, who is attributed with this quote, who was attributed, 1/3 of Jews die out, 1/3 move out, and 1/3 will just disappear into the masses. And if you look 50 years later, that is basically what happened after the communist takeover, right? Between Hitler and the invasion, that's 1/3 of the Russians, and then 1/3 escaped right to America. That's it. And the other third, the Soviet system did an excellent job of de-Judaizing the Jews. So the Russian Jews that came out afterwards had no clue what it was. This is a big thing for them, right? That was a good prediction or a bad prediction of what would happen. And they were increasing oppressive moves against Jews. And we had this series of pogroms, 3-day pogrom against Jews in Kiev, and other actions carried out by revolutionaries, but also encouraged by reactionaries, but also encouraged by the revolutionaries, the Narodnya Volya, right, the will of the people, in the illusion that it would spur the proletariat into revolution. You get the peasant or the factory worker used to beating the Jew, he's next going to turn against the noble and the Tsar and the factory owner. Okay, so what did Jews figure out? Well, you got 3 routes. You can align with the revolutionaries to create the workers' paradise, and so you have in the country with Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, or you go the route of Jewish nationalism, either Jewish territories, that was one theory, or Jewish nationalism in the land of Israel, as Bilu, 1881, and later political and cultural Zionism. But they couldn't really get to Israel at that time because the Turks didn't want Jews in large numbers. And that route was sort of closed. So what else is left? The route of Ellis Island, and also Argentina and South Africa as places where Jews could get to. And of course, the United States proved to be the most immediately doable. Fortunately for our fellow Jews and other immigrants, the period coincided with the growth of industrial power, American industrial power. America was now the new power that burst on the world scene. You know that, right, 1905, Roosevelt was the one who sent the Great White Fleet around the world to demonstrate the new power of America. Battleships, a whole fleet of battleships sailed around the world, stopped in every harbor. Don't mess with us anymore. And he was the one who brokered the peace between Russia and Japan, the Russo-Japanese War. All right, so it was the new America flexing its powers even before World War I. So now we think about the Statue of Liberty and Emma Lazarus, and when we deal with immigration, we like to quote, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest close to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." They were wretched. Yes, they were. They really were. They're coming from not just Jews, also from everywhere else. Extremely poor, extremely sick, having all sorts of baggage with them. So this is a great statement to put on this new Statue of Liberty. But it wasn't Emma Lazarus' poem that reflected what was behind this, that the Americans were suddenly such open-hearted, good people. No, it is the new American capitalist system that made immigration a necessity. It was not a luxury, it was a necessity. So the Irish and the English and the Germans would be brought in. I forget, Germans are the largest single ethnic minority in the United States. Maybe nobody knows it, but they are people of German ancestry. And then it would be the Italians. You let the Italians in, and the Irish in, the Catholics. Nobody wanted Catholics. but you let them in because you needed somebody to operate the country. And then the Jews and the Poles and other East Europeans and Lebanese from the Middle East and Syrians. And then you had the Chinese and the Japanese also. Somebody had to build the railroads, right? So there's some 35 million people that come to the United States in these years, Japanese, Chinese before that, but I'm just giving you this as figures. 35 million people in a country, maybe it was, what, 100, 150 million at the time? It's a huge chunk of the American population. And they're all competing with each other. They're all competing with the native-born American workers. Add to this internal migration to the major American cities of African Americans to northern cities, also at the same time, right? Coming into the beginning of the 20th century, all scrambling for the same jobs now. These factories are hungry and they need them. They're going to use them, going to pit them one against the other also. So who are the Jews that came to the Golden Medina, right? The golden country, that was what they called it. The streets are paved with gold, right? That's the word that came back. Streets are paved with gold. So I just want to let me know when they're ready to serve, and then we'll call. You know, just give me a clue. Okay, just go another few minutes. Okay, so, is it there? Is it ready? No. Okay, give another minute. They'll call. So, think of it. Also, Eastern Europe under the Tsars had been culturally cut off from Western Europe. It was part of the problem that the Russians had. Their contact with the Enlightenment of Europe was relatively late. Peter the Great began the job bringing in foreign tradesmen and craftsmen, building Petersburg and so on. So that was a good century, 2 centuries after these were happening in Central and Western Europe. So also, then with that, also the Enlightenment that had caught hold of Jews in Western and Central Europe was also slowly getting into Eastern Europe as well. So Western ideals of a secular and practical education were just beginning to take effect in Eastern Europe. By the way, keep this in mind also in the Russian governmental and societal structure, unlike Central and Western European structure, where you had barons and nobles against the king, in the Russian structure, the Tsar structure, everybody was subject to the Tsar, a direct vertical chain of command, very different. So my father would say that the word Slav, no, this was from the word slave, because it was easy to control them. That was the accusation. Yeah. But that was the accusation that Central Europeans and Western Europeans said about the Slavs, right? So, okay, so she's already starting that change. That's right. So, but the mentality is they're following the chain of command. It's more, so that affects society. December, okay, that's the break with the system as they begin to push the system apart. Yeah, they begin. So they're just beginning to take effect in Eastern Europe. And so because of that delay, these immigrants had a poorer general background in education, the Jews that came before them, in the Sephardic or the German, all things relative. Their skills were limited in that sense, although they brought experience in craftsmanship, such as tailoring, and they may have had experience with merchandising, simple, small, petty bourgeois shopkeepers. And they also had to their advantage, to a great extent, over other immigrants, that they could read something because they had literacy in Yiddish and some Hebrew, which means if you could read in one language and somebody brought you stuff in that language, you knew what was happening. Whereas the other immigrants did not have that reading ability. So it gave them a leg up. They also had, to keep this in mind, they're not necessarily that they were all well-educated in the Cheder or the Yeshiva, but they had some Cheder background, they had some limited Yeshiva background maybe. They were learning analytic skills, verbal analysis. They're learning basic marketing skills, basic theories of economics, basic theory. That's all in the Talmud and the Mishnah. They were learning it, say, not necessarily great geniuses in it. They were learning some of it. So they're bringing that with them already. So that's what's more than what other immigrants from Europe brought with them, and more than native-born Americans had, maybe to a great extent. Everything is all relative. So keep in mind, the great rabbis did not leave East Europe to come with them. America was not the golden Medina to a good Jew. It was a treif Medina. Treif. unkosher. The whole thing is treif from top to bottom. They feared they would lose their souls in the transition. So there was an attempt to bring some of the great rabbis to America. The communities brought them here. They stayed around for a little while. They saw they were making no impact. They headed right back. I would get into the 20th century changes, but at the end of the 18th century, it was very hard to get these great rabbis. I got some, but very hard to get them. My father told me this. Says now he was in Galicia, so it's not the Austrians, but he said, "Look, who came to America? The ones who couldn't make it here, in my town. They went to America. If you were set, you were set. Why go?" So, in Russia, you had an incentive to go because very few were set. So the incentive was much bigger. This is why the big wave came out of the Russian territories. So for many Jews, the transition to America was devastating. One should never have to be a refugee immigrant. Yeah. Oh, yeah, he tried. Yeah, quite a few. Right. He didn't need his dramas. They had real dramas of their own. Yeah, even with the Statue of Liberty welcoming you, it's hard to be an immigrant. There's some song, Pity the Poor Immigrant, is always difficult. So here, this devastation, or if you come now in this century to America, there's so many social structures and so on, it's a different story. Then there was no backup. There was no social structure of any kind to back the immigrant coming in. So here's somebody from that period writes, Marcus Ravage, with every day that passed, I became more and more overwhelmed at the degeneration of my fellow in his new home. They could see it. Observers could see it. Yeah. Now, these are photos. They're not necessarily Jewish, but you could see the scene, what would have been a typical scene in the slums, right? Apparently blind man asking for a handout. Buddy, what is it, brother? Can you spare a dime? Or here, homeless shelter. Men sleep on the floor of a New York City homeless shelter, 1886. You paid 5 cents a night to sleep on the floor. 5 cents is not cheap. That's a good bit of money to be able to sleep on the floor. So we had the term lost souls for Laura in the mention. And there was a slogan that was a play on the words of the Talmud, Akabia. In the Pirkei Avot, we have Akabia ben Mahalel, one of the great rabbis. So this version is Akabia ben Charlie. Right? Not even Charles, Charlie. Said, consider 3 things and you'll be able to exist in America. Forget who you are, wear your mask in front of those who know you, and do anything you can. That's the new country. That's the new country, right? All of you who came in as immigrants, after that period, you were pampered, relatively speaking, relatively speaking. Okay, I'll go just a little bit more and then we'll pick it up next time. But they were so poor that the New York Times of a century would write to its readers in shock that these were not the fat, rich, and jewel-bedecked people the time readers expected, and as they knew of the German Jews who were very successful. They were so poor that a Jew in a tenement could have twice as high a chance of dying of tuberculosis as the fellow New Yorkers, and tuberculosis was called Taylor's disease because it spread in the sweatshops. Now, very interesting, I found an article in the Journal of American Medicine from 1905, and they say something interesting. Despite this extreme poverty and disease and so on, of all the classes of New York City's population, Jews are the longest lived. So, poor people are dying, Jews die less than other poor people. And they say, considering the manner in which the majority of the Jewish population lives, this is a remarkable showing, if true. So he says, well, poor Jews follow the Mosaic law, and there's a lot of sanitary rules in it, so maybe that's part of it. But insurance men say, while they recognize the temperance of Jews as a factor, they think this longevity is a result of natural selection, the weaker elements of the Jewish race having been eliminated during centuries of persecution. There's Darwin, sheer Darwinism. The Jews who survived were able to live longer because they had the genes to do it. Then he says another characteristic, another factor, Jews have been acclimatized to city life for so many centuries, and they may be the people most resistant to their environment because of that. And as they carried with them traits that have been inherited about being able to live in bad environments of crowding and poor sanitation, whatever's around. No, it's The environment was urban. It was even the shtetl. Shtetl meant a city. It's just a small city. Shtetl was a small city. Some of the exist and Jews were concentrated most heavily in the cities. Even the existence of the shtetl was a response to developments in under the Tsar, which was pushing Jews out of the larger cities, and they were congregated. So shtetl is relatively recent, also in its development because of that. Even that they're more urban. So anyway, again, oh, okay, there were shtetls, right? Except that Jews in the major cities were half the population of the major cities of East Europe. So half of the population of Warsaw and the other cities were Jews. So they're used to living in bad environments. Countryside is healthy. Jews didn't live in the countryside where it's healthy. They lived in a bad city. And so maybe they developed a tolerance. But now he gives a big but, and we can see what's happening. Paresis, which was formerly said to be rare among them, was found to be particularly frequent among the London Jews. London was going through the same thing. What's paresis? I had to look it up. It is the psychosis that comes in as a result of syphilis, which tells me here, the New World, tertiary syphilis, the end stage. Yeah. So it's something is happening to the fiber and the character that maybe will impact. So I'm going to stop at this point, 1247. I'm going to leave you hanging in anticipation how bad it really was, because only if we know how bad it really was can we understand how high these immigrants came. Right? I mean, when you start as wealthy, that's one thing. It's when you start with nothing. When you start from below ground zero, then that is the great miracle. All right, and so we will go ahead next time. We'll follow up, and we'll talk about some of the newer waves. So it was happening 1880, right. From Civil War. Yeah. No, but from the Civil War, by the time you get 1880s is also the start of this great industrial revolution, factorization, the great Carnegies and all these big money people investing and developing. And by the turn of the century, America's a military might. That's the whole thing about Roosevelt's fleet around the world, the Great White Fleet. So America, it was that shift was happening there. Yeah, it was from a third world. Argentina was ahead of. Argentina had a higher standard of living at the turn of that century. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, hold on. Yeah. That Manifest Destiny is earlier. It became an excuse to expand. Yeah. Yeah. But that's still, Manifest Destiny would still be agrarian, though. Right? Because you want land, it's agrarian, cattle land, and so on. The factory thing, it's the factory thing. It's this new marketing, this new industrial world. It is the capitalism at its, right, at the peak, which was supposed to immediately turn into communism, according to Marx. That was the peak of capitalism, right? And they came in just at that time. Racism came as I think a legal racism came as a justification for using other people. I think that's a correct. Right. Yeah. But you didn't need racism to do the takeover. You need racism to give you a justification that you didn't feel guilty. But takeover, you're going to take over. It was a right. Yeah. Well, no, it's also it's to justify to a Christian population that what they were doing was legit. It was to overcome guilt. It was the early, right? The Secretary of State of the Confederacy was married to a woman of mixed race from New Orleans. Jewish bishop, married to a woman, and he used her to make his advancement. She was from an upscale position. So the issue of race developed much later. It's still, I think, classic economic capitalism. Powerful take over. Later on, you come up with systems to rationalize and justify. I think that's the correct way to see it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And they gradually spread out. Well, you remember that, again, everybody hated everybody in this period. Look at the Irish. And then think about Kennedy. From the bottom of the barrel, Irish, to the Kennedys of Boston. The Italians. The Italians were, and they were the very poor, the Sicilians to a great extent, and southern Italy, the poorer parts of Italy, right? No skills except sheep herding. They did very well, but they had to fight their way up. Which one? Teddy? Or Jeffrey? Franklin?
No,
Theodore Roosevelt.
yeah, big anti-Semite.
Theodore Roosevelt is a big anti-Semite?
Yeah.
I don't know that. I don't think so.
He said-
No, that's Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt. Yeah. In his case,
Franklin.
yeah. In his case,
Now,
he
could have saved hundreds of thousands of people
yeah.
if he would bound the railroads going to the.
Yeah. I'm looking at your reports. Around them. Yeah. Yeah. But what it turns out is the people who actually had the access to the bombers were the Russians, the Soviets. They were only, the American lines were much farther away. The Russian lines were next to Auschwitz. They didn't do it. Nobody talks about the Soviets. The Soviets could have done it. They did get it. Yeah. But it's the Soviets who had the tools and the ability and did not.
Yeah.
Oh, I know.
They bombed the city.
I know. Around it. I know.
They didn't bomb the.
Huh? Yeah. I mean, he didn't. Yeah. He didn't love Jews in particular, but nobody loved Jews. Yes. Huh? Yeah, but nobody loved Jews. It's not he. Eleanor Roosevelt fought for the Jews. Why did he send them back? Why was he afraid of going head on heads with them? Why is he afraid? Why did the New York Times hide what was going on? They were Jewish, Salzburg and Oxford. Why did they hide it? They were afraid to let the American public know that it's like they're fighting for Jews. There was a fear. So the Jews were afraid.
But the shit.
Yeah, they kept things, the studios were everybody was afraid. Yeah.
The ship and they sent
Yeah.
they escaped. They saved their life.
Yeah.
And then
Send them back. Right. But again, yeah.
Why Roosevelt had to be careful. This
Yeah.
worked for the Jews. Okay.
The-
That would mean that a lot of Americans would say Hitler's none of our
We forget Lindbergh was an American hero, and Lindbergh was pro-Nazi, the biggest spokesman for Nazis. Father Coughlin of the I don't remember was so. By the way, the American Jewish fear kept on into the 50s and 60s. That I know, kept on into the 50s and 60s. Yeah. Although, and now the Soviet the documents that came out from the Soviets show that he was guilty. She took the fall for him, but he was guilty. Yeah. But the two were talked about in Russia, and the judge was Jewish because, yeah. So. Yeah. That is true. They pulled Jews out from the front lines. And they sent them to the back, which was a big thing. And it's hard to understand the Soviets. Hard to understand also Stalin. Yeah, but it's also hard to understand Stalin. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah. To Tashkent. Yeah, I know. Uzbekistan. But it was hard to understand Stalin. And after the war, he almost killed his Jews.
Well, Stalin-
He was going to, so it's hard to figure him out. Yeah. So anyway, with those 4th of July, 4th of July. Okay. Whatever it may be, it's better here than in many places in the world. Still. Okay. We're ready, huh? Canada Day. Canada, to everybody, to all the Canadians. I have relatives in Canada, so to them also Canada Day. Sort of like, all right, a major neighbor and friend of the United States, very much sharing, especially as good neighbor. Right, yeah. Listen, Mexico's also considered, we have no major wars with Mexico for the last 150 years also. Yeah. Yeah. By the way, the border with Mexico also been peaceful for a long period. Yeah. Also, both sides. Okay. Yeah.
Because it's so insulated, we forget.
We forgot about Canadians.
Well, we just forget that we were on our border, on our continent, actually. There may be internal strife in countries, but in terms of our cross-border activities, we really don't have that in this continent.
Yeah. That's why.
All
Yeah.
the south. So we don't realize the angst of
Yeah.
other people, Europeans and Asians, how just.
That's why Pearl Harbor was such a shock, and why 9/11 was such a shock. Yeah. Oh. Okay. Let's work to keep our blessings and hope that we can spread it to other people's. To everybody, we'll wish you Shabbat Shalom, happy 4th. Okay, we'll turn off the streaming then also.